Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Yalowitz, the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'd like very much to welcome you to what is our first Great Issues lecture of this year, 2009. This particular lecture is the Rabbi Marshall Meyer Great Issues Lecture on Social Justice. And it is an annual Dickey Center event made possible by a gift from Andrew and Marina Lewin. Andrew was a member of the class of Dartmouth of 1981, and his son Josh is now a sophomore here, but presently in France. Rabbi Meyer himself graduated from Dartmouth in 1952. He founded the Seminario Rabbinico Latinoamericano, a rabbinical school that became a center of conservative Judaism in Latin America. During the years of the Argentinian military regime, which was 1976 to 1982, Rabbi Meyer became a strong critic of the military government and its violations of civil rights. He worked to save the lives of hundreds of people who were being persecuted by the regime, and he visited prisoners in jails, and among them was the renowned journalist Jacobo Timmerman, who dedicated his book to the rabbi who, and I quote, brought solace to Jewish, Christian, and atheist prisoners, unquote. This annual lecture, drawing on the Jewish value of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world through social action, features a person who is truly helping to heal the world and expressing the values that Rabbi Meyer saw as the core of Judaism. And I certainly agree that our speaker today does that. Just a word now about the Dickey Center's Great Issues lectures. These commemorate President John Dickey's conviction embodied in the Great Issues course taught at the college during his presidency, and namely that an important part of a Dartmouth education is acquiring competence in civic engagement and responsibility. In other words, what we try to do is to make sure that all Dartmouth students have an understanding of the major international issues of the day, but equally or more importantly, a commitment to do something about them. And this is no way better summarized than in John Sloan Dickey's own words. He told Dartmouth students at Convocation in 1946 that the world's troubles are your troubles, and there is nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. And those are truly outstanding words. And now it's a great pleasure for me to call on, excuse me, the new head of our, excuse me, my mind is going blank on me for the moment, but the new dean of the Tucker Foundation, Richard Crocker, who is here today and who was installed yesterday as the dean in a beautiful, beautiful ceremony, which I hope many of you were able to attend. But it really is an honor for me to present him to you today. He is, of course, also the chaplain of Dartmouth, but taking on this very important responsibility yesterday. It was a beautiful ceremony, and we wish him all good luck and success in what he's doing. Richard.
Thank you. We are particularly pleased to have Kul Chandra Gautam, class of 1972, as this year's lecturer, as this year's Rabbi Marshall Meyer lecturer. Mr. Gautam is doubly honored since he is not only this year's Rabbi Marshall Meyer lecturer, but he also is a recipient of this year's one of this year's Martin Luther King Social Justice Awards a few days ago, specifically the Lester B. Granger Class of 1916 Award for Lifetime Achievement in Social Justice, which is awarded by the William Jewett Tucker Foundation, which is why I have the pleasure to introduce Mr. Gautam. Mr. Gautam has done very much and deserves a very lengthy introduction. I will be exceedingly brief because I expect many of you have already heard him at one of his appearances during the last 4 days, and because every minute I talk is one less minute for him to talk. But it's important that you know just this, that Mr. Gautam is from Nepal, that he came to Dartmouth as a result of meeting a Dartmouth grad who was serving in the Peace Corps in Nepal, that he's had an illustrious career at Dartmouth as a student, and that then he went to an illustrious career after graduate study at other institutions I will not name, to the United Nations. In addition to his major duties as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, he served for a long time as Deputy Director of UNICEF, overseeing UNICEF operations in over 150 countries. Mr. Gautam has recently retired from the United Nations and has returned to his native country of Nepal, where he continues to be engaged in thoughtful advocacy. Listing all of Mr. Gautam's responsibilities, as I said, would take too long. What you need to know is that Dartmouth is honored to have helped such a man launch his distinguished career, and that a continuing passion of Kul Chandra Gautam has been the well-being of the world's children. He has made a difference, and this is the subject he will address today as he speaks to us on the subject of child survival, the cutting edge of human rights and human development. No one could better exemplify for us the spirit of both the Lester B. Granger Award for Lifetime Achievement in Social Justice and the Rabbi Marshall Meyer Lecture on Social Justice. Mr. Gautam, we welcome you back to Dartmouth, where we hope that there are students waiting to take your baton and carry it on.
Thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction, and Ambassador Yalowitz, thank you so very much. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this lecture, the John Sloan Dickey Foundation and the Tucker Foundation, and the Marina and Andrew Lewin for their generous support. I'm deeply grateful for this enormous honor to deliver the 2009 Rabbi Marshall Meyer Lecture on the great issues of social justice as we conclude 2 weeks of extraordinary celebrations recognizing the life and contributions of Martin Luther King Jr. These 2 weeks also coincide with the good vibes being sent around the world by President Obama, who came to power, as we would all agree, not because of the color of his skin, but because of the content of his character, as Martin Luther King had dreamed. Rabbi Marshall Meyer was another dreamer, much less known than Martin Luther King, but championing similar causes of human rights and human dignity. To be honest, I had not heard of Rabbi Marshall Meyer when I was at Dartmouth. I first heard about him, learned about him, actually, when I read that book, Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number, that Ambassador Alowitz mentioned. But although I did not know Rabbi Meyer when I was at Dartmouth, my interest in Latin America developed and deepened when I was here. President Salvador Allende of Chile was one of my favorite world leaders when I was at Dartmouth. In my youthful exuberance, I also was fascinated with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, and the Colombian liberation theologist Camilo Torres. Along with protests against the overt U.S. war in Vietnam, the covert U.S. attempts to overthrow the popularly elected government of Salvador Allende in Chile were two major issues that turned me into a student activist while I was here at Dartmouth. My involvement in the anti-war movement against Vietnam eventually led me to join the UN and to serve in Indochina. And my interest in Latin America, nurtured here at Dartmouth, led me to spend a considerable amount of my time at UNICEF dealing with the plight of children in Latin America and the Caribbean. Rabbi Meyer dedicated his life to fighting for human rights and social justice in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. He challenged the Jewish establishment for its conservatism and insisted that social justice be at the center of religious consciousness. He was a leading American supporter of the Israeli peace movement. Were he still alive today, I am sure he would have spoken out against the carnage of so many innocent children who died in Gaza during the recent war. Dear friends, at first, my lecture this evening, entitled Child Survival, the Cutting Edge of Human Rights and Human Development, might not seem that relevant to Rabbi Meyer's legacy. But I hope that we will be able to see that it is or ought to be at the very center of all human endeavors, including the humanistic vision of Rabbi Meyer that he championed so eloquently and passionately. So let me start with a provocative question. Why should child survival or reducing child deaths be such a high priority when there are so many other problems in the world, from rapid population growth to climate change, from eradicating poverty to combating HIV/AIDS, from preventing wars to promoting human rights? Why should child survival be such a priority? Well, without being exhaustive, let me share with you a couple of reasons. First, protecting your young and vulnerable citizens is the very essence of human life and human civilization. If instead of thinking about the billions of people in the world and millions who die, let us think about our own families. How much importance would each one of us give to saving the lives of our own children if they were at risk of dying? I bet that most of us would give it the highest priority. And if saving the lives and protecting the health and maximizing the well-being of our own children is so important for each one of us, shouldn't child survival and well-being at a global scale be our collective priority? And look at it from the point of view of the child. If you don't survive, nothing else counts. Of course, mere survival is not enough. We also want our children to survive and thrive. We want them to be healthy, well-educated, and productive. We want them to grow to their full human potential. But a dead child cannot grow up to his or her full potential. Survival is the first step to fulfilling that human potential. Besides being the morally and emotionally the right thing to do, promoting better child survival also helps address many other problems that we worry about. I will not dwell on the economic arguments for investing in child survival, which are plenty. But let us take an issue like global warming and climate change, which are the hottest topics of debate these days. Why do we care about climate change? Isn't it because we are worried about the world that our children will inherit? Or put it another way, if you were a parent who cannot even ensure the survival of your own children, should you be expected to care about protecting the earth and its environment? We care about the earth, the climate change, saving the forest and endangered species, and about human rights and human wrongs because we care about children and their future. How about population growth? Well, experience shows that people begin to have smaller families and fewer children only when they are confident that their first children will survive. Thus, paradoxically, improving the chances of child survival actually leads to slower population growth rather than to population explosion. Child survival and well-being are indeed the central concerns around which much of the whole human civilization revolves. That is why child survival and development are such a central part of the Millennium Development Goals, which today comprise the most universally accepted human development goals, an agenda promoted by the United Nations. Now, how are we doing on child survival globally? The short answer is better than ever before. But the longer answer is not good enough, and certainly not commensurate with our capacity in this 21st century. UNICEF started keeping track of how many children die globally every year in the 1960s. At that time, 20 million children died in a year. Last year, UNICEF came out with the latest data, which showed that the total number of child deaths had gone down to just 9 million from 20 million. With the tremendous population growth since the 1960s, if there had been no progress, child deaths would have increased to 25 million per year instead of the spectacular decrease that we have seen. Now, while we celebrate this achievement, the continuing loss of over 9 million young lives still each year, that is 25,000 children dying every day, or 1,000 children dying every hour. That is a blemish on human civilization in this day and age. This death toll is unacceptable because most of these deaths are in fact readily preventable and easily treatable. There are many and complex underlying causes of child mortality, but there are also many simple and low-cost interventions to dramatically reduce child deaths. Simple diarrhea, pneumonia, malaria, and measles continue to be the major killers of children, accounting for half of the world's child deaths. Infections, malnutrition, neonatal conditions, accidents and injuries, and HIV/AIDS account for the rest of the child deaths. Most of these deaths can now be prevented for pennies or at most nickels and dimes. The survival and well-being of children are, of course, intricately linked to the good health and well-being of mothers, and both depend on the continuum of care to ensure the survival and health of newborns, young children, and their mothers before, during, and after their pregnancy. There now is a consensus on a short list of interventions that are proven and affordable. None of these interventions will bankrupt any country's treasury. With modest technical, policy, and financial support from donors, even the poorest countries in the world can launch such programs. Indeed, many already have, with some good results. In recent decades, progress in reducing child mortality has been quite spectacular in most countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, in Central and Eastern Europe, in East Asia and Pacific, and North Africa and the Middle East. Most countries in these regions are already on track to achieve MDG 4, that is the goal for reducing child mortality. But unfortunately, because of civil war, abject poverty, and the heavy burden of HIV/AIDS, progress has been slow in sub-Saharan Africa. A number of countries, including Kenya, Congo, Chad, Zambia, Zimbabwe, are actually going backwards. Their child death rates are rising instead of declining. Similarly, the status of child survival remains very precarious in Afghanistan, in North Korea, in Burundi, Rwanda, Swaziland. Still, even in sub-Saharan Africa, there are hopeful signs of progress in quite a few countries, which have reduced under 5 mortality by more than 1/3 in the last few years. In my home country of Nepal, 40 years ago when I left for Dartmouth, 400,000 children used to be born every year, and of them 100,000 died before they reached 5 years of age. Last year when I returned to Nepal, 800,000 children were born, but only 50,000 died. Now, what do these figures tell us? On the surface, it seems like Nepal has done a good job on child survival, but a bad job in family planning. But hold it, behind these figures lies another deep truth, not widely understood, that parents tend to have many children when child mortality rates are high, and they begin to voluntarily reduce family size only when they feel confident that their first children have a good chance of survival. In Nepal, we began to see this parental confidence that their first children will survive around 1990, when child mortality rates had declined by 50% compared to the 1960s. Then we started seeing a steep decline in both birth rates and death rates. Thus, a typical family in Nepal had 6 children in 1960, 5 children in 1990, but only 3 children by 2007. Steady decline in child mortality rate, therefore, had quite a direct, though slightly delayed, impact in fertility rates. What is especially remarkable in the case of Nepal is that during the last decade, we had a terrible civil war with thousands of civilian deaths each year, destruction of infrastructure, interruption of many basic services. But even during that time, both child deaths and child birth rates and even maternal mortality rate continued to decline, even in the middle of the war. And luckily, Nepal, one of the poorest countries in the world, is today on track to achieve quite a few of the Millennium Development Goals. Much of this progress in child survival in Nepal and elsewhere is the result of increased use of basic health interventions, such as oral rehydration therapy, exclusive breastfeeding, immunization, vitamin A supplementation, use of insecticide-treated bed nets, and very importantly, increase in girls' education and women's empowerment. Now, you might legitimately ask, if such proven low-cost technologies already exist to dramatically improve child survival, why are they not being widely used? What are we waiting for? What is missing? In the world of international development, we have learned that existence of proven technologies, cost-effective solutions, and common-sense approaches are necessary but not enough. We also need visionary leadership, strategic management, popular participation for common-sense programs to be applied widely. Now, I have had the good fortune to work for over 3 decades with one of the most effective parts of the United Nations, UNICEF, in a global movement for child survival and development, which embodied these kinds of strategic management, popular participation, initially under the inspiring and visionary leadership of a man named James Grant, who was the head of UNICEF. This evening, I would like to share with you some highlights of what I learned and why, as the title of my lecture says, child survival can be the cutting edge of human rights and human development. Now, this leader, Jim Grant, he was one of the true giants of public health in the 20th century. He came from a family of medical missionaries. His father, John Grant, was a pioneer of public health, a public health approach in China that came to be known as barefoot doctors. Later, this approach became the inspiration for what today we call the primary healthcare approach. During 15 years of Grant's leadership, UNICEF articulated and led a movement for child survival and development with relentless energy and unflagging commitment. It made child survival not just a health issue or a development issue, but a matter of children's human rights. UNICEF helped devise a unique strategy emphasizing simple, low-cost, low-tech interventions like immunization and breastfeeding and growth promotion and oral rehydration therapy that could produce quick and tangible results. The genius of this approach was to demonstrate the power of skillful advocacy, communication, and social mobilization to take public health to the doorsteps of ordinary people on a massive scale. When he took up the leadership of UNICEF, Jim Grant found it unconscionable that 15 million children were dying every year, 40,000 a day, in a world which had the knowledge and means to prevent most of those deaths. He led UNICEF to advocate for a massive increase in coverage of such life-saving interventions as immunization and oral rehydration therapy. Immunization coverage in developing countries was less than 20% in the 1980s. UNICEF argued that world needed to increase it to 80% by 1990. Now, many thought that such an increase was unrealistic. Indeed, if we followed the normal incremental approach, such acceleration would have been impossible. Most ministries of health did not have the manpower, financial resources, and organizational outreach to make a quantum jump of that kind. Recognizing that, UNICEF developed a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, we would approach not just ministers of health, but presidents, prime ministers, governors, mayors to adopt immunization and other child survival activities as their own programs and not those of the ministries of health. Leaders were persuaded that provision of such life-saving services would give them great political dividends and votes in elections at minimal financial cost. On the other hand, UNICEF would approach religious leaders, the mass media, film stars, sports personalities, non-governmental organizations to promote immunization, ORT, and other child survival actions. We enlisted Audrey Hepburn, Peter Ustinov, the James Bond Roger Moore, and football star Pele, singer Harry Belafonte, and actress Vanessa Redgrave, as we do today with Roger Federer, Ricky Martin, Shakira, Bono, Angelina Jolie, to promote the cause of child survival and human development. Such outreach and mobilization greatly reinforced and energized the usually weak and lethargic ministries of health. As a result, the actions or inaction of health services came under national spotlight. This helped to revitalize health services by giving them unprecedented political visibility and subjecting their performance to public accountability. Grant was masterful in generating a healthy competition among countries, provinces, and municipalities to outperform their neighbors. If an economically poor country like Sri Lanka could reduce infant mortality to a low level, why was not a much richer country like Turkey or Colombia or Indonesia doing better? UNICEF used such public comparisons not to humiliate countries, but to motivate them to do better. In the name of child survival, UNICEF was even able to stop wars and create corridors of peace and days of tranquility to immunize children and provide other basic services. In the mid-1980s, Grant persuaded the president of El Salvador and got the Archbishop of San Salvador to broker an agreement with the leftist rebel groups to stop the war for a few days every year so health workers could travel throughout the country without any restrictions or fear and vaccinate children. Such days of tranquility became a model and were used in many countries at war, including Afghanistan, Angola, Burundi, Congo, Lebanon, in Sri Lanka, Sudan, and elsewhere, including in the more recent efforts to eradicate polio. In the name of child survival, UNICEF was even able to convene the largest gathering of world leaders in history, the 1990 World Summit for Children. I personally had the honor to help draft the declaration and plan of action of that summit, which adopted ambitious and measurable development goals for children. It was that Children's Summit which paved the way for the major world conferences and summits of the 1990s on population, on environment, on women and development, all of them culminating in the historic Millennium Summit in 2000. Indeed, the origins of today's Millennium Development Goals can be traced back to the goals that were originally set by the World Summit for Children. The child survival and development revolution that UNICEF spearheaded under Jim Grant's leadership was credited with saving the lives of an estimated 25 million children and protecting the health of millions more and putting child rights high on the political agenda of the world. Now, there are some critics who argued that Jim Grant and UNICEF oversimplified the world's development challenges by boiling them down to just a few vertical technical interventions aimed at reducing child mortality. After all, development is much more than reducing the quantity of deaths. How about the quality of life? Social justice, gender equality, economic development, human rights, protection of environment, building up systems and infrastructure to sustain development gains. Now, those of us who knew and worked with Jim Grant knew that far from being simplistic and narrowly focused, he had a broad and holistic vision of development. UNICEF was very aware of the multifaceted nature and complexities of development. It spoke forcefully on issues ranging from the need to end the apartheid of gender, to reducing military expenditures, to providing debt relief and fair terms of trade for developing countries. Let us recall that in the 1980s, structural adjustment policies imposed by the World Bank and IMF forced many governments to balance their budget by cutting expenditure on health, education, and social services. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Rates of malnutrition increased. Governments were unable to replenish essential drugs or even pay the salaries of teachers and health workers. It was the poor people, and especially children, who suffered from such cutbacks. UNICEF protested loudly and made a passionate case for protecting the poor and the vulnerable in times of adjustment. It called for adjustment with a human face, which gathered strong support from development activists and eventually forced the World Bank and IMF to change their policies. UNICEF advocated for the child survival revolution with a small number of highly doable interventions, not as a simplistic formula for just reducing mortality, but as a Trojan horse for combating poverty, accelerating economic growth, and promoting democracy by empowering people. How did we do that? Let us not forget that nothing is more disempowering to parents than to see their children die. Inability to save and care for their children makes parents feel powerless and fatalistic. On the other hand, when parents feel that they can take action to save their children's lives, they feel a sense of empowerment rather than helplessness. When parents know that simple, low-cost action can save their children's lives, they begin to demand such services. And once basic health is assured, parents begin to demand basic education, water and sanitation, nutrition, and other social services. Thus starts a virtuous cycle of empowerment and upward mobility. Child survival need not and must not be a matter of charity or simple vertical medical interventions. When pursued by unleashing the power of social mobilization, moral persuasion, and behavior change, it can become a powerful force for social transformation. Now, many of the diseases that kill children in developing countries are also found in the rich countries. It is not uncommon for children in rich countries also to get diarrhea and pneumonia and infections of various kinds. But because they have proper immunization, better nutrition, and access to clean water and sanitation, children in these rich countries can withstand these diseases and do not die. But the same diseases and infections can be fatal for poor children in poor countries. In other words, it is not really diseases that kill. It is poverty that kills children. The association between poverty and child mortality has long been recognized. Today, over 90% of the world's child deaths occur in 60 countries, all of which are low-income and least developed countries, or the poorest areas of middle-income countries. These same countries also account for the vast majority of maternal deaths, malnutrition, and lack of safe drinking water and sanitation. Indeed, much of the world's greatest tragedies befalling children are concentrated on the bottom billion people of the world who subsist on less than $1 a day. Please close your eyes for a moment and imagine, what would you do if your income was just $1 a day or $5 for a family, for food, for shelter, for clothing, for education, for health care, for festivals, and for funerals? It is such degrading poverty that kills 25,000 children every day. It is poverty that keeps 93 million children out of primary schools, and most of them are girls. It is poverty that lands millions of children in child labor, often in hazardous conditions, when they should be going to school. It is poverty, debt, and unemployment that lead desperate parents to even sell their vital organs like kidney to provide for their children. And when all else fails, parents are even forced to abandon their children, sell them to brothels or bonded labor to work in slave-like conditions. This happens in our world today in the 21st century. Dear friends, because they bear the heaviest burden of poverty, all efforts to combat poverty must give the highest priority to children. Remember, 80% of human brain is formed in the first 18 months of a child's life. So whether a child will grow to live up to his or her full human potential, whether a child could ever aspire to attend a great college like Dartmouth, or the child will be condemned to be a slow learner, a poor achiever in life, is largely determined in the first few years of the child's life, even before the child goes to primary school. The damage caused by malnutrition, infection, and poor child care in early childhood often lasts for the whole life, and it cannot be easily reversed later. Now, some say that, well, poverty has always been with us, and it will never be completely eliminated. That may be true in the case of relative poverty, but we simply cannot accept and should not accept the indignity of absolute poverty as the unavoidable fate of humanity in this world of incredible wealth and prosperity. Today, in spite of the global financial crisis, we live in the most prosperous of times in human history. World economic output reached $60 trillion last year. And according to the Forbes magazine, the number of billionaires in the world reached a record 1,125 billionaires in 2007. At this time of unprecedented global prosperity, we have the contrasting situation of nearly 1 billion people, as I said, living on less than $1 a day, 800 million people going to bed hungry every night, 1 billion people without access to clean drinking water, and 2 billion people without access to proper sanitation. What an incredibly unequal and unjust world we live in. Mary Robinson, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, often says that poverty is the greatest violation of human rights in the world today. And children are the greatest victims of this violation of human rights. The time has come for all of us to consider the struggle for survival and the fight against child poverty everywhere, in rich as well as in poor countries, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of human rights and a foundation for human development. We now have a global plan of action to fight poverty in the form of the Millennium Development Goals. It is estimated that to achieve these goals, it will take massive efforts by developing countries, backed up by an additional investment of some $50 billion a year in external assistance. Now, $50 billion is a lot of money. But consider that in the context of the world's military expenditure of $1 trillion every year, or the US military spending of some $150 billion a year right now in one country, Iraq alone. Friends, or consider that in the context of hundreds of billions of dollars that are being allocated to bail out huge Wall Street firms and banks and automobile companies right now. As you can see, it is not that the world does not have enough resources to fight child poverty. It is more likely that leaders of the world and we, the citizens, do not give enough priority to combating such poverty. As Martin Luther King said, there is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in human will. Or as Mahatma Gandhi said, the world has enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. Friends, I began this lecture by saying that the vast majority of the world's child deaths were due to a handful of diseases that could be readily prevented or treated. I then went on to say that actually what kills children is not really disease, but poverty, which is a little harder to tackle than diseases. Now, upon further reflection, I must confess that what kills so many children in the world today is neither disease nor poverty. So what is it? It is, in my humble opinion, our non-recognition and non-respect of children's basic human rights. What we desperately need today is to invoke the spirit and legacy of Martin Luther King, Rabbi Meyer, and emulate their stubborn and relentless struggle for human rights against all odds, now on behalf of the world's children. At this historic juncture, the whole world is looking to Barack Obama with so much hope and expectation of a renewed American leadership to help tackle the major problems facing humanity. I hope that we can all press for America to put the survival and well-being of children at the center of its global development agenda. Now, to their credit, successive US governments of different political parties have been great supporters of child survival in recent decades. there has been commendable bipartisan support in the US Congress for global child survival programs and for UNICEF. But in the eyes of the rest of the world, the United States of America today also stands as a country that has so far failed to ratify the world's most universally embraced human rights treaty. That is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I do not know how many of you in this audience have read the Convention on the Rights of the Child. You can find them in Google, you can find them around. I would commend it to all of you. It is one of the most progressive, one of the most balanced and thoughtful treaties that deals with both civil and political rights and economic and social rights of children. It was written with great care, deliberation, and strong participation and leadership of distinguished American scholars and experts. Since the UN adopted this convention in 1989, it became the world's most rapidly and universally ratified human rights treaty in history. A record 193 countries have ratified it. Only 2 countries have not: Somalia and the United States of America. Now, Somalia is understandable. As you know, it has been a failed state without a functioning government for the last 2 decades. But the US does have a functioning government, which claims to be a great champion of human rights in the world. It baffles many non-Americans and even some Americans as to why the US is reluctant to ratify this treaty. Not only has the US failed to ratify the convention, but whenever other member states try to put in strong reference to child rights and the convention in important negotiations at the UN, for example, the US delegation always tries to delete or weaken or water down such references. As a senior UNICEF official, I have been witness to many intergovernmental negotiations at which the US delegation and those of other member states are at loggerheads on the issue of child rights. I must confess that I always found most of the arguments put forward by the US delegates in opposing the convention and references to child rights rather flimsy and unconvincing and driven actually by narrow domestic political considerations. It was very sad for me as a friend of America who studied at great American universities like Dartmouth and Princeton and Harvard, and who is greatly inspired by the ideals of US democracy and commitment to human rights, to see my American colleagues, including my American bosses, Jim Grant, Carol Bellamy, who were the heads of UNICEF, deeply frustrated and embarrassed by the US government's reluctance to join the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, to be fair, there have been many leaders in the US government, including at the highest level, who have been very supportive of the convention. I want to recall to you and share with you a most touching episode. In January 1995, Jim Grant, the former director of UNICEF, he was hospitalized with terminal cancer. From his deathbed, he wrote to President Clinton, pleading with him as an American citizen that the US government sign on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. He died a few days later after signing that letter. The following month, at a memorial service for Jim Grant at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, the then First Lady Hillary Clinton came with a message from the president. She said that in response to Jim Grant's last wish, President Clinton had instructed Madeleine Albright, who was the US ambassador to the UN at that time, to sign the convention. The whole cathedral erupted with joy at that news. The following week, Madeleine Albright did sign the convention on behalf of the United States. However, fearing that many conservative senators would not support it, the Clinton administration did not forward the convention for ratification to the Senate. When President Bush took over, the new administration made it clear that it had no intention whatsoever to pursue the ratification of the convention. Now that President Obama has committed himself to regain the lost American leadership in the world and to follow a more multilateralist approach and honor U.S. commitment to international conventions, all of us, child rights activists all over the world, are hopeful that the U.S. will finally ratify this convention. In a statement at Walden University in October 2008, presidential candidate Barack Obama said, and I quote, "It is embarrassing to find ourselves in the company of Somalia, a lawless land. It is important that U.S. return to its position as a respected global leader and promoter of human rights. I will review this and other treaties to ensure that U.S. resumes its global leadership in human rights," unquote. I hope that President Obama will keep this campaign promise, and we will all help him to do so. Certainly, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton needs no reminding of the importance of the convention. And the new U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, is equally committed to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There is a U.S. coalition for the ratification of the convention involving many civil rights organizations, child rights NGOs, religious groups, and academic institutions that are keen to re-energize the campaign for U.S. ratification of the convention. I would hope that Dartmouth College, the Dickey Center for International Understanding, the Tucker Foundation, and others would strongly take up the issue of U.S. ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Nearly 30 other universities have already joined the campaign for the U.S. ratification. You can check the list at www.childrightscampaign.org. I would urge Dartmouth to join this group, not only to join this group, to lead this group. After all, Dartmouth is famous for taking up the cause of little guys and small institutions and the underdogs. Every member of the Dartmouth community knows Daniel Webster's memorable defense of Dartmouth, don't we? "It is, sir," he said, "a small college, but there are those who love it." In that very spirit, it would be so fitting for Dartmouth to take the lead among America's universities, the cause of the little boys and girls of the world, the cause of child rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The very essence of human rights, as Martin Luther King and Rabbi Meyer taught us, is to protect the weak and vulnerable, the disempowered and the disenfranchised from the tyranny of the strong and the powerful. Children cannot vote, and their voices are not heard in the councils of power where policies are made and resources are allocated. Protecting their rights is therefore the obligation of all enlightened adults like us in all democratic states. In a very fundamental sense, human rights begin with the rights of children, and a society that does not accord high priority for their survival and well-being really fails to honor its human rights obligations. Yes, the world has many other problems, and Dartmouth has many other priorities. But most other problems can wait. Children cannot. They have only one chance to grow, and we all have a duty to help them survive and thrive. As a proud Dartmouth alumnus who devoted all his professional life to promoting child survival and defending child rights, I would urge you, I plead with you, to take up the challenge of securing full U.S. support for the Convention on the Right of the Child in the same spirit as Daniel Webster and our predecessor took up the defense of Dartmouth College itself. After all, there is no nobler cause than the well-being of children, who today represent half the world's population, but all of its future, isn't it? Thank you.
here to take questions for a while, and we have a policy of favoring students, so we hope that the first questions will be asked by students, and then we'll open up to others. So, are there questions or would you like to ask? Since students are silent, we can ask others. Yes.
Hey,
Could you stand, please? I don't think we'll use microphones, but if you could just let everyone.
Okay. It may not matter at this point if perhaps things are promisingly moving forward with ratification, but I am curious what some of the reasons, quotation marks, reasons or justifications have been given for not ratifying. We're just left here bewildered too.
Can everyone hear?
So the question was, what are some of the reasons given for the US not ratifying the convention? There are a number of reasons given. Actually, in that website that I mentioned, there is a frequent questions and answers where they describe what are the normal questions being asked. I can give you a couple of examples that the questions have been raised. One question that often Americans, the more conservatives, seem to raise is child rights. Isn't that against parental authority? Parents should have the responsibility. Wouldn't ratifying this convention reduce the rights of parents and give total freedom to children to do whatever they want? That's one reservation. Another comment is, there are many people in the US who feel that any international conventions are dangerous because they give too much power to the United Nations or some outside world. We have a constitution of the United States. Why do we need to sign any conventions? We have a perfect constitution. Or there are arguments like, well, will not children sue their parents in courts? What are you going to do? Will not children engage in, they are so free they can do anything, they will get out of control. Or how about the usual issues like abortion? Will girls be free to go and have abortion as they like? Or a whole series of issues like that. Now, let me tell you that all of these issues have answers. And these concerns, based on the experience of 193 countries over a 20-year period, these concerns have proven to be totally invalid. There has never been one case in which a child has filed a case against parents in 193 countries in 20 years. Should the US be so afraid? No. The issues of abortion, these have never arisen in this experience. Will the US lose its sovereignty? That has not happened. In fact, it's very interesting. This convention has got two optional protocols. One is on protection of children from armed conflict, like the issues of child soldiers, etc. And another one is an optional protocol on the sale of children, trafficking of children, prostitution of children. Those two optional protocols the US has ratified, but it has not ratified the mother convention, just the optional protocols. Now, if some of the things that we are worried about were to happen, why would the US ratify those conventions? Now, it is true that when you ratify a convention, you are required to prepare a report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. That committee is an advisory committee. It gives you advice. It never chastises countries. But in any case, if there are reservations like that, international conventions allow for member states to express reservations, their understanding and declarations. And this whole question about, will the family be weak? You know, nobody is more concerned about the family than the Holy See, the Vatican. They have ratified the convention. Abortion, there are many countries that are worried about. Philippines has very strict abortion laws, stricter than the US or Ireland, a number of countries. They have ratified the convention. So many of these issues are really unfounded. Now, the US actually has had, we have Professor Gene Lyons, who is a scholar on these issues. The US has a track record of, it takes a long time for the US to ratify any convention. The Genocide Convention took 30 years for it to ratify. And there is a convention against discrimination of all forms of discrimination against women that is even older than the Children's Convention, 30 years. It has not been ratified yet. There seems to be an undue fear in the US that somehow these conventions will reduce the US's sovereignty. Not at all so. And as I said, in drafting this constitution, US lawyers, US scholars were deeply involved to make sure that these are actually quite consistent with, compatible with the US Constitution. In any case, there is a Supreme Court verdict in this country that no international convention can override the US Constitution. So there is no need to worry. But there seem to be highly exaggerated, very ill-informed views that seem to influence quite a few of the senators. And the administration just hasn't dared to take these issues on so far. So again, there are Q&As in that website. I would encourage you to go there. You can see all the other reservations and some of the answers to those reservations.
If you want to ask a question, raise your hand high so we can see it. Yes, and just speak loudly, please.
I was wondering if you could discuss with the audience the current status of the State of Israel to UNICEF.
Current status of Israel to UNICEF?
Yes.
You mean in terms of UNICEF actions there?
Yes.
Well, UNICEF has a history of helping children in need wherever they are, regardless of the political alignment of their parents and leaders. So UNICEF provides help to children everywhere, particularly in developing countries, because richer countries are usually assumed to be able to take care of their own children. So UNICEF, and I'm retired from UNICEF, so I'm not quite up to date on the very latest, but I know that UNICEF provides support for the Palestinian children in Gaza and elsewhere. But UNICEF has excellent collaboration with the government of Israel. Israel is a supporter of UNICEF. There is in every industrialized countries, there is a committee to support the activities of UNICEF. There is one in Israel, very active and very supportive of UNICEF. So Israel-UNICEF relations are, because UNICEF deals with children, it is a non-political organization, are, from as far as I know, very smooth, very cordial, and UNICEF support is much appreciated by the Israeli government, including for the Palestinian children in the various parts of the occupied territories and in Lebanon and Jordan and in the neighboring countries.
There's a question down here, yes.
You're providing very good insight from the United Nations perspective and discussing the various countries, the nation states. I kind of sense a conflict with the support of the countries who often are the ones that are subjugating or repressing the children. Do you put all of your hope in the United Nations and as it relates to various countries, or do you see a role for maybe a global civil society that works outside of the system of countries? You mentioned NGOs, things like that.
No, I would say that the United Nations is only one player among many. As far as children are concerned, First responsibility lies with parents and communities. The next responsibility lies with the national government. Then responsibility lies with child-oriented NGOs, church groups, etc. And then the international community. Among the international community, there is the United Nations. So I think we need to put that in perspective. And I would say that there are many organizations helping children. Nowadays, we have, if we take, for example, the health area, there are many public-private partnerships globally. The Gates Foundation has become a big player. The Turner Foundation has become a big player. So besides governments, non-governmental organizations, there are also very important private sector players. So children are everybody's business, and everybody needs to give priority to children, and I would not rely on any one organization, including the UN or UNICEF. But UNICEF has a very important role to play because it plays a normative role. It does the analysis. It does advocacy. It does, each one has got their comparative advantage. There are certain things that UNICEF can do that other organizations cannot do. But there are other things that other organizations can do that UNICEF may not be able to do. So I would not rely on the UN so completely or so wholly. You need to consider UN as one among the players, quite an important player globally, because it sets norms and standards. And there are many bilateral donors. Many bilateral donors also tend to have their bilateral interest, whereas the UN is supposed to be more neutral because UN does not have its own interest. It is the interest of member states. And when it comes to something like children, it is the best interest of the child. That's what the convention is all about. The guiding principle is in matters concerning children, when you have doubt, should I do this or should we do this? Be guided by the best interest of children. So that is the line that UNICEF and the UN promote.
Are there others? Yes.
Especially in light of the flimsy, baffling arguments that some have put up against ratifying the convention, it seems that at the very core of this issue is a certain integrity that we need to inculcate, like as you said, making it a priority. And you mentioned that Dartmouth helped you nurture the social activist in you. So could you describe to us more the internal process that you went through that allowed you to become the person that you are?
Yeah. That will be a long story. The short version of it is that actually it was Dartmouth education, and not only education, the overall Dartmouth experience, including the extracurricular activities and the setting and the timing of my presence here at Dartmouth, that led me to my career in the international organizations. I was here in the late 60s, early 70s. Those were the most exciting time to be on any university campus in America. It was at the height of the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. It was at the height of the Civil War movement, civil rights movement. I recall in 1968, the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. That had created a sense of anger and anxiety, but also what must we do for such things not to happen? It was the beginning of the environment movement, the women's rights movement. So the campus was bubbling with action. And everybody was involved, including President John Sloan Dickey, President John Kemeny, very actively supportive of such activism. And I was a beneficiary of those circumstances. And like many others, became quite active. Different people become active in different things. My major being in international relations with Professor Jean Lyons there, who was the head of the international relations program. Obviously, my interests were on international affairs. And it was particularly the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement that veered me towards the UN, because when I saw that this relatively small and poor country, Vietnam, How was it that it was able to take on the world's superpower and bog them down and ultimately defeat them? The only war that the US has lost. There must be something about these people. I wanted to learn about them. So here on campus, as there was all of this activism, I took a couple of courses on Indochina politics and history and became very curious. And I said, I would like to go to Vietnam one day and find out about these people. Vietnam is a French colony. So better learn French. Dartmouth had an excellent French language program. So I even went to France to study French. So I actually prepared myself. Dartmouth education was very helpful as I was majoring in international relations. But I must say international relations, Jean, you will recall, at that time was largely about East-West relations. Remember, that was the height of the Cold War, the Soviet bloc versus the NATO and the other blocs. Now, my real interest was much more on the North-South relations. There was not that much offered at Dartmouth at that time. So I went to Princeton for graduate school, and Dartmouth and Princeton together, where I studied economic development, combined it. So when the opportunity came to join the UN, I was ready with this solid foundation really built here, and it has served me well. And I hope it will serve you well too.
Others? Anyone else? Yes, in the back row.
Hi, Mr. Gautam. Being from Nepal myself, I'd like to ask you a question about, we've come to learn that the 10-year-long Maoist insurgency in Nepal, during that conflict, the Maoists used a lot of children in their militia. And now that the Maoists have been elected to power in a democratic process, how do they view their actions, and what steps are they taking, along with the UNICEF branch in Nepal, to redeem themselves or make amends for it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You are absolutely right. During the war, the Maoists, these are the guerrillas in Nepal, insurgents, they did use a lot of young people. Many young people were attracted to them, and quite a few underage soldiers or combatants were used. When you ask the Maoists, they deny that they use any child soldiers at all. However, there was a UN mission, as you know. The UN mission, when the ceasefire was agreed to, it was agreed that all the Maoist guerrillas, the combatants, would be kept in some cantonments, and the Nepal army would be kept in their barracks. They would remain in the respective barracks. That was part of the agreement. But before deciding who goes to the cantonments, the UN was asked to verify that they were legitimate, because they were not in one place, they were scattered everywhere. And as soon as people heard that Maoist soldiers will be put in cantonments, rumors started going on that, hey, join the Maoists, you can go to the cantonment, you will get a UN salary and it will be good for you. So lots of people all of a sudden who were perhaps not with the guerrillas before started joining. So the Maoists claimed that there were 34,000 such soldiers. Then the UN verified them according to when were they recruited, how old were they, because anybody below the age of 18 is not accepted. And when the UN verified it, in fact, out of the 34,000 that the Maoists had, only 19,000 qualified. But even among them, there were 3,000 children below the age of 18. And those were supposed to be released. That was part of the agreement. But for one reason or the other, they have not yet been released. In fact, on the 28th of December, both in the Kathmandu Post and in Kantipur, I have an op-ed piece precisely on this subject, of child soldiers and the need to release them. They have now agreed officially with the special representative of the Secretary General of the UN on Children and Armed Conflict that they will release them all by the 28th of February. I doubt that they will do that. In fact, I had a meeting with the Maoist Minister of Peace and Reconstruction, who says that actually we do not accept that we have ever used children, but we do acknowledge that there were some in our cantonments who were disqualified for various reasons, and that we will try to deal with them. The UN is putting a lot of pressure, so are other child-oriented non-governmental organizations, and that we need to work hard to get them released, but it is not a question of just releasing them. Now they need to be rehabilitated, they need to be given training, so that there is a big risk now. There are many other splinter groups who are recruiting children. So we don't want to them to be released from the Maoist cantonment to be recruited by another group. So it's not an easy issue, but I know it is being dealt with, but it has taken too long. You're right.
One last question. Is there one? Yes, it is.
Hi.
Having worked at my own country's mission, I observed how it was ironic that these countries really struggle in the negotiations and they really fight for every single word. And at the end, these resolutions, they do get adopted, but they don't necessarily get implemented. I just find it ironic that the only very valid organ of the UN is the Security Council that has imposing power, per se, over the resolutions that are produced. And I was wondering, what do you think about, because a lot of people or a lot of organizations, they criticize UN for not doing its job well, for being inefficient or weak, whatever, but I see that it might be just arising from the fact that these resolutions, they don't necessarily get enforced on the countries even after they ratify them or accept them. So do you think somehow UN could or should have more power over enforcing, implementing these resolutions? Thank you.
Well, one would hope so and wish so, but remember, the UN Charter speaks about we the peoples of the United Nations, just like the US Constitution speaks, we the peoples of the United States of America. But unlike the US Constitution, the UN Charter, the UN is not really the organization of we the peoples. It is the organization of we the sovereign governments who are jealous of our sovereignty. And don't you interfere in our internal affairs. It's our sovereign right. And therefore many countries don't allow the UN to intervene unless it is convenient for them and helpful for them. When it is inconvenient for them, they hide behind sovereignty. And this is a huge problem, not easily solved, because the UN was founded on the basis of sovereign equality of member states. And I think what is needed is, in another forum I have spoken about, like every organization, UN has its weaknesses and imperfections. Dartmouth has its weaknesses and imperfections. So do we in our families. We all need to change and reform from time to time. So does the UN. I think 3 areas where UN needs real reform. One, you pointed out right at the beginning. UN is supposed to promote democracy in the world. But the most powerful organ of the UN, the Security Council, is the most undemocratic institution. It was established right after the Second World War by the victors of the war, and perhaps there was some reason to have the veto powers and 5 permanent members at that time. But since then the world has changed. At that time we had 50 states, now we have 193. So the world has changed, but we have not been able to change the Security Council of permanent members. So this is at the crux of some of the problems. Another problem is because of sovereignty, as I said, UN is not able to intervene, but there some interesting ideas are coming now. Kofi Annan, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, 2004, at his Nobel acceptance ceremony, in his speech, he said that far too many crimes had been committed in the name of sovereignty. That when a country, when a government is unable or unwilling to protect its own citizens against massive violations of human rights, then the international community should take on the responsibility to protect those vulnerable. In situations like, you see today, Zimbabwe, the country is being destroyed by a dictator, but says, well, it's my country, we are sovereign. Or Burma, or North Korea. And the international community has been generally helpless. In Burma, at the height of the terrible cyclone, when hundreds of thousands of people were dying, they would not allow international relief work easily. So if there is one problem that needs fixing, it is to ensure that the responsibility to protect by the international community is agreed to. That, I am afraid, is not going to happen by the actions of governments alone. It will require massive civil society activism to persuade governments, because some of the great historical changes in the world have come not through the initiative of governments, but through initiative of people power, citizen power. How was slavery abolished? It was not the initiative of one government. It was a movement against slavery. I think that kind of a movement is needed. And when such movement happens, we hope that the imperfect UN can be made slightly more perfect, but not easy.
Mr. Gautam, you've been very inspirational. I hope that there are students and even non-students in the audience who will respond to your challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you indeed.